22,000 years ago, a small band of Ice Age humans stood in the open with no fur, no claws, and no biological reason to still be alive. The cold alone should have finished them. So, how did they make it? Every other animal that made it through the Ice Age did so with biology. The woolly mammoth had 4 inches of fat beneath its skin. The Arctic fox had fur that could trap body heat at negative 50 degrees Celsius. The cave bear simply slept through the worst of it. Homo sapiens had none of that. No insulating layer, no hibernation reflex, no migration instinct hardwired into the brain. What they had instead was something no other species on Earth possessed in the same way: the ability to talk about what they knew and make sure that knowledge outlived them. Anthropologist Brian Fagan, who spent decades studying Ice Age survival, puts it plainly: fluent speech meant that when someone figured out which plant stopped bleeding or which valley sheltered the best herds in winter, that discovery didn't die with them. It traveled, band to band, generation to generation. A storyteller sitting beside a fire 25,000 years ago was doing something no mammoth, no cave lion, no competing species could replicate, uploading survival data into other human minds. And then they went a step further. They carved it into stone. The cave paintings at Lascaux and Chauvet in France aren't what Victorian explorers assumed they were. Mystic ritual, primitive decoration, the doodlings of a species with time to kill. Wildlife biologists who study those images today can look at the condition of a painted reindeer's hide and tell you what season it was when the artist made the observation. The coat thickness, the antler growth stage. These were field guides, encyclopedias of the natural world, pressed into rock walls so the next generation wouldn't have to rediscover everything from scratch. The cave was the server. The paintings were the files. That institutional memory fed directly into what came next. Between 40,000 and 10,000 years ago, the period archaeologists call the Upper Paleolithic, toolmaking made a leap so sharp it looks almost discontinuous in the record. For the first time, humans began producing tools whose entire purpose was to make other tools. The most important of these was called a burind, a rock chisel, unremarkable to look at, that cut precise grooves into bone and antler. Those grooves produced spearheads and harpoon tips, small, light, durable, and interchangeable, so a hunter could swap out a broken tip mid-pursuit without stopping. Think about what interchangeable parts meant in a world with no supply chain. It meant a weapon system, not just a weapon. But here's the part that reframes everything. Even with compound spears, even with coordinated bands of hunters sharing generational knowledge about animal migration routes, the weapons only worked at close range, close enough in some cases that hunters had to physically leap onto their prey to land a kill. The technology was extraordinary. The proximity required was still terrifying. So they solved that problem too, and the solution was less about courage than about architecture. At a site in eastern France near a limestone formation known as the Roche de Solutré, Ice Age hunters built fires every fall and every spring, not for warmth, to steer. Migrating herds of wild horses and reindeer, funneled by the fires, were driven into a narrow valley where the terrain itself did the containment work. Once inside, the animals could be killed safely and efficiently at close quarters. The meat was dried and stored for the months ahead. Archaeological evidence shows this coordinated operation ran for tens of thousands of years. The same location, the same seasonal timing, the same method, refined and passed down through exactly the kind of institutional memory those storytellers were preserving beside their fires. Cognition didn't just keep them alive, it let them industrialize killing at a scale no other predator on Earth could match. The margin between survival and extinction, though, was still razor thin, and the next threat wasn't something a spear could fix. The Roche de Solutré operation ran for tens of thousands of years. Same place, same fires, same method. Could you have figured that system out, or would you have just charged the herd and hoped for the best? Drop your answer in the comments below. Dudes roughly 45,000 years ago were wearing animal hides draped loosely over their bodies, functional enough as a sleeping bag. Useless the moment you started moving through sub-freezing wind for hours at a stretch. The hide would gap at the neck, the wrists, the ankles. The cold would find those gaps, and in sustained exposure, that was enough to kill you. The invention that changed this wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a fire-starting technique. It was a needle. If you saw one from 30,000 years ago, you'd recognize it immediately, fine-pointed at one end with a small hole at the other for thread. That's it. That's the object. But what that needle unlocked was something no draped hide could ever achieve: clothing tailored to the individual body, fitted tight enough that cold air had nowhere to enter. An Ice Age tailor didn't just grab one skin and call it done. They selected deliberately reindeer hide for the outer layer, Arctic fox fur for insulation, hare skin closer to the body, sometimes ptarmigan feathers worked into the lining. 3 or 4 layers, each with a specific job. The innermost layer wicking moisture away from the skin. The middle layers trapped heat. The outer parka shed wind and water. Thread was spun from wild flax and other plant fibers, and it was dyed turquoise, pink, which tells you these people weren't just solving a survival problem, they were making decisions about aesthetics in the middle of an ice age. This wasn't primitive. It was functionally identical to what a modern mountaineer wears above the tree line today. Assembled from scratch, by hand, with no blueprint. The needle was the margin. Without it, the layered system doesn't exist. Without the layered system, sustained movement through northern winters becomes a death sentence. Brian Fagan, who has spent decades studying this period, calls it the most important invention in human history. Not the spear, not the wheel, not fire. A needle. Shelter closed the remaining gap. Ice Age humans didn't live deep inside caves the way early archaeologists assumed. They lived in rock shelters, natural depressions cut into riverbed walls beneath protective overhangs, and they modified them heavily. Large hides were draped from the overhang to block the wind. Inside, wooden poles and sewn hides formed tent-like structures arranged around a central hearth. The fire didn't just produce heat, it reflected off the rock walls, doubling its own output, turning the shelter into something closer to a thermal envelope than an open campsite. In summer, when the hunters moved out onto the open plains stretching from the Atlantic coast all the way to Siberia, they built dome-shaped huts partially dug into the earth. The framework was a latticework of mammoth bones, hunted or scavenged from carcasses covered in sod and animal hide. Occupied for months at a time, warm enough to survive in. Now, close the loop, the hook opened. The global Homo sapiens population at the glacial maximum was almost certainly in the tens of thousands, a number so small that a single catastrophic winter in the wrong location could have ended a lineage permanently. Every invention in this chain, the burin that shaped the spearhead, the needle that sealed the parka, the mammoth bone frame that held the roof, was a margin measured in degrees of warmth and hours of exposure. Remove any one of them and the arithmetic changes. The species doesn't make it to the next generation. The thread snaps. They didn't survive the ice age because they were biologically equipped for it. Every other animal in that environment was better equipped. They survived because they refused to accept the cold as a fixed constraint, and then they taught the next generation not to accept it either. That instinct, the one that looks at an impossible environment and starts problem solving instead of surrendering, is the same instinct that is watching this video right now. 22,000 years of distance and the operating system hasn't changed. All right, I'm gonna go invent fire. Again, you hit subscribe while I'm gone. Deal? See ya. Oh, and remember to like the video.